a lot of these lines on maps, which we kind of allowed to shape our conception of the world, are basically, they're all made up. They were invented by somebody at some point, and you can imagine parallel timelines in which the lines went somewhere else.
Hello and welcome to the pod. Today we're looking at borders, boundaries and maps, and my guest Jonn Elledge joins to discuss the big ones. The Mason Dixon Line dividing north and south in the US, the partitions of Ireland and India, Israel and Palestine, and perhaps most controversial of all, Middlesex. Plenty more great history is on the way, including the ancient Greeks, why we go to war, Valkyrie, the Tom Cruise movie on the 1944 plot to kill Hitler, and much, much more. If you can give me a gentle, soothing rating on Spotify or Apple, I'd be hugely grateful. And I do want to give a shout out to those who've done so already. Thank you, you're in my heart. But until then, I'll hand you over to me and Jonn Elledge discussing borders, boundaries and maps. Jonn, welcome back to the pod. Great pleasure to have you back on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's nice to speak to you again.
Well, for the benefit of listeners, we're going to try and bumble along here because we can't see each other. And so you're probably going to look horrified as we chat about your new book, A History of the World in 47 Borders, the stories behind the lines on our maps. And Jonn,
yes,
and Jonn, when we last spoke, that was for Conspiracy, which you co-wrote with, I think, Tom Phillips.
Yes, my great friend Tom, who's a lovely, lovely man. And I had to do this one without him.
Well, yes, you can't use his absence as a reason not to talk about things in this book. So I thought...
No, not at all.
I thought we could start with, like, quite early on in the book, there's a big sort of map boundary. It's always interested me because it's so weird and it derives from ancient Greece, which makes me happy, having studied ancient history. And it's the border between Europe and Asia, which is sort of rather arbitrary, I suppose, in certain parts.
It's incredibly arbitrary. I sort of find it. I've always found that one fascinating because it's entirely made up, isn't it? If you look at a map of the world, okay, like North and South America are a single landmass, and Africa is the same landmass as Asia and Europe. But there is at least kind of an isthmus between them. There is a point where, like, you can see sort of two landmasses meeting, whereas Europe and Asia are clearly just the same bloody thing. It's entirely kind of culturally constructed, and it all makes a lot more sense when you kind of realize it is the ancient Greek conception of the world. Like, if you kind of imagine, if you're in the Aegean in sort of the 6th century BC and you don't really know what's out there, you just know where the land masses are in relation to you, then as far as you're concerned, there is basically land in 3 directions, and you might as well consider those to be separate things. And it kind of it just sticks because of everything that happens later with the church and the rise of Islam and so on, and then European powers going out and colonizing the rest of the world. But there is absolutely no sort of non-socially constructive reason to kind of imagine Europe and Asia to be two things at all. Like, Europe is basically just the western end of Asia, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But actually, it's why because it's sort of an ancient Greek view, and we're so far disconnected from, particularly classical Athens, 5th century, and this is a boundary that I like. I'm happy with.
You're comfortable with this one, then?
I am, because we're living in an ancient Greek world in that regard.
Well, one of the things I found funny about researching that chapter is that even, I think it was Herodotus, the father of history himself, even he in the 5th century BC was going, I don't really understand why we've got this system of continents. It doesn't make any sense to me, but someone came up with it. So, like, even by the time you get to classical Athens, people are already looking at it and going, well, this is a bit bloody stupid. But, as history has gone on and the Mediterranean world came to realize that once you get beyond the Black Sea, there is no fundamental division between Europe and Asia. They are the same thing. It just looks particularly absurd, I think. But it's kind of a different sort of border than many other ones in the book. They're kind of more sort of more objectively political borders. But I wanted to include it largely to kind of show, to really highlight the extent to which, like, a lot of these maps, a lot of these lines on maps, which we kind of allowed to shape our conception of the world, are basically, they're all made up. They were invented by somebody at some point, and you can imagine parallel timelines in which the lines went somewhere else.
And I guess this sort of leads me on to something actually I probably wanted to mention at the beginning, but because your interest in this, you've written about particularly tube maps, and you did a really good podcast for the New Statesman. Was it Metro?
Skylines, it was called.
Skylines. I loved it. I loved
Yeah.
it. It stopped a few
Oh,
years ago.
thank you. It did. No, it was kind of a spin-off from a spin-off. So the New Statesman had a website called City Metric, which was about urbanism, transport, maps, and all that jazz, which I created and edited for 6 years. And then when I left the company and they relaunched City Metric, the podcast went with me. But we did about 150 episodes over 4 years, so it did all right.
Yeah, because I remember, I mean, it had a really good intro as well, and the Mind the Gap was on there. It was all sort of about, was it mainly London transport? You had some map men on there who have a very good YouTube show. But was this where you kind of, have you always been interested in maps, and so the book has come out of that?
Yes, kind of. So there's a number of different ways of kind of telling the origin story. The kind of, like, the chronologically first one was that in 1993, the BBC showed a documentary series called Tales from the Map Room, which I rewatched a couple of years ago during the pandemic. And my grandfather recorded it for me, and I used to watch it over and over again. It was just one of those things. You know how you get really obsessed with things when you're a kid. And like, there's loads of great stories about how maps have kind of shaped our sense of reality. Like, the first episode is called A Tissue of Lies, and it's about how many inaccuracies there are on that we take for granted on maps of the world. Like, the fact that the Mercator projection shows Greenland as bigger than Africa and all that kind of stuff. So a number of the stories that ended up in the book came from there. It was stuff I've been interested in for 30 years. There was also on when I was running City Metric, I used to do a semi-regular feature called Boundary Issues, which was literally just kind of like, well, this is a stupid line on a map, isn't it? How did that happen? And the idea of turning it into a book kind of span out of that. But I was to some extent just kind of looking for a topic where I could do lots of different things. Like, I'm not a historian, I'm a nerd, but history is one of the things I'm nerdy about, and I wanted to kind of write a book with lots of history in it, but also these kind of sort of geographical or kind of cartographic stories that I've always been into. And also I like stories about people being idiots, and a book of stories about lines on maps seemed to be a good way of kind of bringing those things together.
Well, I was going to ask about this, so I'm kind of jumbling up what I was going to talk about or ask you about. And so you've mentioned Mercator, which we'll get onto, but you mentioned people being idiots. And as I was reading through the book, I realized, particularly, I guess, around Sykes-Picot, do you think it's a particularly male cartography is a particularly male pursuit?
So I've always assumed as much. Yeah, like, it did, like, the sort of the audience I kind of built up writing about this stuff over the last decade does feel, far from exclusively, but I would say predominantly male, sort of 70-30. And, like, it does seem to be quite a male impulse to kind of codify the world like that, and to kind of simplify the complexities of reality into something you can kind of see at a glance. But I'm going to caveat that, because once I tweeted this thesis, and I got a whole load of of crap from the writer and feminist campaigner Caroline Criado Perez, who very strongly disagreed with me on that front, and spent about a year after that repeatedly sending me stories of important women from the history of cartography, or women who were particularly interested in maps. So I should at least acknowledge that that's maybe not true, but my starting assumption is that there's a certain amount of truth to it. Yeah.
Yeah, because I guess why I asked that was because it seems there's sort of, I don't know, maybe I'm misgeneralizing and being a terrible misogynist, but men drawing lines on maps in not a particularly empathetic way, whereas one imagines when a woman is doing that, she's going to be a little bit more empathetic about the people that are going to be impacted by it.
I'm not sure I go quite that far in that. I mean, so much. You've also got to remember that the history of diplomacy is a history of men. Like it's relatively recently there have been significant numbers of women kind of round the table for these things. So like so many of the stories in the book are ones that are dominated by men, but that's because history was to a large extent. And also I think you don't have to go looking that far for female political leaders who've maybe shown a striking lack of empathy, even in, for example, recent British history. So I'm not sure I'd kind of go quite that far, but I do sort of feel like the people who get really into maps do feel slightly more likely to be men than women.
Yes. Well, speaking of men and maps, and you've mentioned Mercator, so let's talk about Gerard Mercator. So these maps I mean, they're actually quite beautiful to look at. In particular, I mean, you deal with Ireland, I think,
Mm.
the Mercator map of Ireland, which is, it's a sort of a fantastical island.
Yes, so like I got quite a long way through writing the book before my editor very gently said to me, "You do realize you are going to have to do Ireland and you are going to have to do Israel. You can't just kind of leave them out and hope we're not going to notice."
Yes, we'll get to
So
Israel,
these
John,
were
I'm afraid. Yeah.
yes. Oh, good. Well, there's something to look forward to. But yes, these were among the last chapters I did, and I kind of wanted a way of approaching the history of the borders in and around Ireland that were a little bit. I wanted a way of kind of condensing basically 800 years of atrocities into a relatively small number of pages. And so there's two Ireland chapters. One of them I kind of look at what are known as down survey maps of Ireland, which are the very first maps properly sort of like surveyed colonial maps of an entire territory. So, like, in the Mercator map you mentioned comes from the early 16th century, I think, and there's kind of quite they're things of beauty, but like you look at the map of Ireland and it is basically here be dragons, it's like that kind of high fantasy style map. And then the down survey maps happened about a century later, and it's much more like it's like the Ordnance Survey today. It is like a properly detailed, accurate map of a country, and that came into existence. That entire kind of great leap forward in cartography happened because an imperialist power wanted to know what it had conquered and how to divide that land up amongst its own people. And so I just kind of found that like slightly, as a map fan of many years standing, it was slightly horrific to realize the extent to which like modern cartography is basically a subset of imperialism. Like it does come out of the imperial interest.
Yes, absolutely. I mean that Ireland is the perfect transition that between this sort of Mercator onto the down survey map is the transition, isn't it?
Mm.
It's extraordinary actually. It reminded me, and while I was reading that particular part of the chapter of a Brian Friel play called Translations. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, which is
I'm not sure I am, but I think I might have a copy somewhere.
it's
But
a
no, tell
wonderful
tell me your translations.
It's a wonderful, wonderful play with lots of humour, and it's basically British officers from the Royal Geographical Survey appear in rural Ireland, and there is whilst they're sort of fiddling around with their maps, they're renaming they're renaming towns into an anglicized version, and meanwhile there is a school where you have the teacher. He's teaching in Gaelic and in Latin, and it's wonderfully lyrical play. And I'm rabbiting on, so tell me to shut up.
No, this sounds like a play I should really know.
It is what it actually was on at the National Theatre about 2 years ago. It was really good. And where am I? So when he does converse with these, when the teacher of this, I think they were called hedge schools. So they were schools that would take place out in the open. And when he bumps into the geographers, he converses with them in Latin, and he doesn't like to speak English because it's such an ugly language. And it's just it is a lovely, lovely play with loads of humor, but it does show that kind of clash of modernity and colonialism.
I mean, like to a large, this is something that comes up again and again in the book. The extent to which it is much more a book about imperialism and colonialism than I perhaps realized it was going to be going into it. Like I thought it'd be like more of a sort of like, hey, this is a funny line on a map kind of story, and you just kind of like end spending hundreds of pages working through the history of European imperialism.
Yes, well, I was looking through. I've been dipping into it. I have to confess, not reading it from cover to cover. So I hope you can forgive me.
Oh no,
But
of course it's that kind of book. Yes.
yeah, it is. It's really lovely. And just so for the listeners' benefit, it's sort of very short chapters that are just overflowing with information. They're very enjoyable to read. And I wondered actually, and perhaps you've done this, so I haven't got to it, is if you look at the sort of developing United States of America after independence and the expansion of I guess, the western border, and how I wonder, was that mapped, or I mean, it kept on heading further west, didn't it?
No, so like actually, it's one of the original essays on Citymetric, which kind of inspired the book, was about a thing called the Northwest Angle, which is a part of Minnesota across an inland lake from the rest of the United States. So if you just kind of look at the landform, you would imagine it would be part of Canada, but it ends up part of the United States because the boundary was defined by the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which drew an end to the War of Independence, the Revolutionary Wars, and Britain and the newborn United States kind of agreed where the line between the US and British North America would run through the wilderness, which nobody had surveyed. So there is some language in there about how the line will run west from the northwesternmost point of the Lake of the Woods to the Mississippi. And there are a couple of problems with that. One of which is nobody knew what shape the Lake of the Woods was. So there was some argument over where the northwesternmost point of it was. The other was that the Mississippi doesn't go that far north. And the people who made up this treaty didn't know this. So they ended up like, if you, with a literal reading of the treaty, like the boundary would just kind of round and round the planet for the rest of time. So they had to kind of rewrite the language. And in doing so, they ended up cutting off this part of this territory that logically should be part of Canada and giving it to Minnesota, where it remains to this day. There's about 120 people in the town, and every time they want to leave the town, they basically have to go through Canada. And like, there's a few oddities like that on the US northern border, just because nobody had done the survey before they'd find it.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. Well, I guess we're in America and we're talking about America. And one line on a map that I absolutely find fascinating is the Mason Dixon line, which you write about.
Yeah.
Now, the reason why I'm I guess obsessed, well, not obsession is not the right word. So interested in it is because of the Pynchon novel, Mason and Dixon, which I know you've
Mm.
referred to in a footnote, which really pleased me because I think it's probably it would make my top 5 novels of all time.
I shamefully have not read it. I think
John,
it's about
that
800
upsets me.
pages long or something. I know, but as I understand it, it gets a bit sort of magic realism-y, doesn't it? Which I find striking and quite a clever thing to do, because like the Mason Dixon line is one of those lines that's kind of been imbued with this cultural power, where we hear the name and we kind of imagine it's the border between the northern United States and the southern United States in the Civil War, between the Union and the Confederacy, and it's not that at all. It's a much narrower line. Can you have a narrow line? It's a much more narrowly defined line between Delaware and Pennsylvania on one side and Maryland on the other. It's about 400 miles of state boundary, which Mason and Dixon, a couple of English surveyors, were sent to survey to kind of settle 80 years of land disputes in the 18th century. And that somehow their names get attached to the whole concept of like the border between the Union and the Confederacy, even though it's nowhere near it. I just find it kind of fascinating how like there's a few of these. There's kind of where the signifiers kind of slip free of what they originally relate to.
Yeah, and it's an amazing achievement, scientifically, isn't it? To produce a straight line like that.
Yeah, I mean they did actually do the work. So like you can still find stones along the border to this day with like an M on one side and a P on the other to kind of mark which state is which side. But yeah, no, they did actually kind of like go to all the effort over several years of kind of surveying 400 miles of border, which is why people actually knew where that border was meant to go, which they didn't necessarily know with a lot of straight lines you find elsewhere on the maps of the world. So like if you continue following the US northern border to the west, for most of its length, it follows, I think it's the 49th parallel, but surveying technology was not all it could have been. So actually, it kind of like wobbles around it a little bit.
As you say, it's such a significant cultural boundary. I mean, there are books still being written about it. I mean, one written just the other month that we had in our magazine, and particularly with, I guess, well, I don't want to venture too much into contemporary American politics, particularly if we're going to be dealing with Israel and Palestine.
Yes.
And I was going to talk about Northern Ireland, the partition of Ireland, and we'll ask you about it. So I'm dancing around here. Can we do the partition of Ireland then? Can we talk about that? Because I'm very interested in this. My family are from County Antrim.
Okay. So
So
that ended up in Northern Ireland, didn't it, Antrim?
yeah, I think there was never going to be any doubt that Antrim would, but it's the border today. I don't know if you've traveled around the borderlands today. You're in the Republic 1 minute and then you're back in the United Kingdom the next.
Yes, no, as I understand it, there are roads that do just kind of zip in and out, which was like this. This came up a lot during the sort of post Brexit debate, didn't it? About how exactly like you could practically sort of bring that border back.
Yes.
Never mind the kind of political consequences there. Just like physically, what could you do?
Exactly. And this is one of those because there are a few boundaries like that you write about, and the partition of India as well, which were borders that no one actually really wanted. Did you find many like that?
Yes, I mean the partition of India is like one of the stories I kind of found most I found most of it fascinating and devastating to research because it's one of those stories that nobody comes out well from. My instinct as kind of liberal metropolitan guilt-ridden Westerner was to kind of think it was all the fault of the British. A lot of it is. There's a lot. The empire did include very deliberate divide and rule, kind of like setting communities apart from one another and so on. But like there's a lot of there are a lot of into sort of communal riots leading up to that period, and the division of India is basically the division of the what had been India was pushed for by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, head of the All India Muslim League and the first Prime Minister of Pakistan, because he had watched what had happened to an ethnic and religious minority in Europe earlier in the same decade, and was like, well, I do not want Muslims to be a minority in India. So he wanted there to be kind of a safe state for India's Muslim community, which becomes Pakistan. But also, it didn't occur to him that like if you create this thing, people are going to have to move. Like he was apparently shocked at quite how many millions of people end up getting on the road. But also, like this, like Britain announces that India is going to become independent as two separate countries before anybody has got around to kind of working out where this border are going to go. So in Punjab on one side of the country and Bengal on the other, like there are millions of people who literally do not know which country they're going to be in. And when they finally announce the line, there's something, it's basically ethnic cleansing. There's millions of people forced to move in either direction. It's a truly horrifying story that's only just out of living memory, really.
Yes, and obviously still living with the legacy today. And
Mm.
I mean, okay. So I mentioned Israel Palestine. Let's go in now. Actually, what I wanted to ask you about most was rather than the past, it was the future, because there was a paragraph I think towards the end of that section that really interested me. Because in the wake of October the 7th, there's been a lot of discussion over one state, two state solutions here. But I think in the paragraph you write about what are potential solutions, you mentioned a confederation, and I hadn't heard about that, and I was very interested in that.
So I should confess up front that this chapter was written before October the 7th. Um, and hurriedly edited quite late in the process of getting the book out. So it does end on a slightly optimistic note that I'm no longer sure is how I would necessarily end it now. But yes, the idea of a sort of confederation, that's not something that like I plucked out of the air, or that the people I was writing about who proposed it had come up with recently. That is the UN Minority Report from 1947, I think. The UN produces two reports about the partition of what was then the Palestine Mandate, in terms of like how to kind of divide it up between the Jewish and Arab communities there, and one of them was basically create a two-state solution. I mean, we wouldn't call it a two-state solution then, but it was basically like we will divide this into two countries, one for each community. But there was also a minority report which said, hey, well, like, given the sort of slightly odd distribution of land and the fact that these two territories are always going to be quite intertwined, wouldn't it make more sense to have something that looks a bit like basically Belgium? So you end up with two largely self-governing communities that effectively function as separate states in all sort of domestic policy, but in terms of what would have been like foreign defense, I think like there will be kind of a confederation sat on top, and that is the model you end up with in Belgium. It's not a million miles away from what the EU does now. This was something that was seriously kind of considered in the late 1940s, but then events rather overtook things, and there was a war, and then Israel comes out of that, and so like it kind of went. It was never really strongly on the table at that point. But there are people on both sides of that divide who kind of talked about it more recently as like a potential solution, in that kind of like having kind of some shared institutions, but largely kind of separate communities. And this felt like a very nice, an optimistic note to end on. When I wrote the chapter, I'm not sure that feels terribly plausible right now, given October 7th and everything that's followed, the horror show in Gaza. But it is also, it's just as difficult to see a two-state solution working at this point. So I don't know what the future looks like, but it does feel like they can't go on like this.
Yes, yes, but I think you're right. It does seem a little optimistic. Okay, well, shifting on to, I think a happier place of boundary confusion is Switzerland and Liechtenstein. This is a very amusing. I spend a lot of time in Switzerland actually hiking, and I didn't know that Switzerland have been invading. Seems like it's sort of something that Switzerland does to Liechtenstein every 10 years, and I didn't even know about this.
Yes, no, it happens all the time. The Swiss keep accidentally invading or bombing Liechtenstein. It's
How
happened.
are they got a reputation for neutrality? I do not know.
So far as I can tell, it's like Liechtenstein is obviously a very small. It's a microstate. It's something like 30,000 people, and basically like, it's the size of an English borough or something. It's no space at all, and unsurprisingly, it doesn't have a militarized border with either of its neighbours, Switzerland or Austria. So the border to Switzerland, part of it is, I think, it's the very bottom of the River Rhine, possibly, or a different river. I think there's some fairly sizable foothills of the Alps as well, which maybe divide. But for part of it, for at least 20 miles or something, it's fairly open land. You can kind of just nip in and out. Um, and the reason things keep going horribly wrong is because Switzerland has conscription, it has national service, so it happens on training exercises, basically. So like every few years, a bunch of Swiss teenagers are kind of lumbering about on their training maneuvers, don't realize they've crossed the border, or on a couple of occasions don't realise quite where they're aiming their artillery and accidentally attack Liechtenstein. And the Liechtenstein government have been very good about this, it must be said. They've never attempted retaliation. They've never taken it to the UN. But nonetheless, it seems to have happened repeatedly over about 50 or 60 years.
Yeah, it's so funny. It's so lovely to read about, two neighbors that are, I guess, happily forgiving and forgetting despite this happening so frequently. It's a model for many other nations, I think. Right. I think we're coming to the end of, we're running out of time, but I wanted to talk about time zones because you've included time zones right at the end of the book, and there are some, actually, I haven't mentioned the Uyghurs at all in any of the history we've been talking about on this podcast. I'm delighted that you've mentioned them, but in reference to time zones. So what's the relationship between the Uyghurs' time zones and the wider China?
So yes, China, as listeners will no doubt know, is quite a big country. Actually, one of the chapters I ended up that ended up on the cutting room floor, which I ran instead as a post on my newsletter, was about empires that never fell. We kind of think of China and Russia, and to a certain extent, the United States, in fact, as nation states when territorially they are basically empires. They conquered a bunch of territory and just kind of incorporated them into the metropole. But one side effect of this with China is like it's 2,000 miles wide or whatever it is. It's a stretch of territory that should logically, if you kind of did it rationally, it would probably stretch into 5 or 6 time zones. But since the time of Chairman Mao, it has been the policy of the government in Beijing to keep the entire country on Beijing time. And in Xinjiang, in the far west where the Uyghurs are, that's sort of 2 or 3 hours behind Beijing time rationally. So one of the many ways in which the kind of the minority population, the Uyghur population of the west of China, kind of rebel against the government is to set their watches to what they think should be the correct time zone. um, and there are reports from Human Rights Watch that people have literally been sent to camps for this, which is horrifying. But they just kind of thought that was sort of an interesting form of rebellion. And this is time zones are as time zones are as political as anything else, really. Like I think there are also examples of countries like Venezuela and North Korea have both switched to different time zones at different points to kind of show that they are not they are not in the same time zone as their diplomatic enemies. I just find it kind of fascinating that either you would think that time would be relatively apolitical, but no, not at all.
Yeah, yeah. It's a lovely way to end the book, actually, and perhaps a subject for your next one. And so I suppose we've reached the end, and we haven't even talked about Middlesex.
We haven't. Were we going to talk about
Well,
Middlesex?
we know
I
we weren't.
forget
The
things.
reason why Middlesex doesn't really exist, does it?
It doesn't. No. So actually, I gave you the where at the start of the show, I kind of gave you the kind of potted history of where the book came from. I actually totally ignored a bit, which is the embarrassing reason I have an interest in borders, which is that I grew up in a place which used to be Essex and is now in Greater London. And it was very, very important to me as a rather pretentious, nerdy teenager that I wasn't really from Essex. I was from Greater London. Um, so my interest in Middlesex is a county that was completely abolished by the rise of Greater London. So my interest in Middlesex and what it stood for is a long standing, yeah.
Yeah, it's a county that I have a lot of affection for, and I suppose it was you who brought up the fact that it actually doesn't exist. So I have you to thank for that.
Yes, no,
Um,
the vast majority of it has been swallowed by Greater London, and I think there's a tiny bit that was now in Surrey. So maybe Middlesex should declare war on Surrey, like the Liechtensteiners and the Swiss.
well, sport's the replacement for war, so Middlesex will just have to beat Surrey at cricket. This has been lovely, John. Thank you very much for your time. And the book is out hardback. It's available now. It's been out for a few months, actually, isn't it?
It has. It came out at the end of April. It's available in all good bookshops and probably also some bad ones. Please do buy a copy. It's lovely.
Well, links to One Bad One is in the show notes. But thanks very much, John.
Thank you so much for having me. Good to talk to you.
Thank you very much for listening. Coming up on Saturday, it's Why We Go to War with Richard Overy. But in the meantime, thank you and good night.